Ted's positivity is survival, not personality. Ted Lasso's relentless optimism is not a personality trait. It is a survival mechanism built by a child who watched his father die by suicide, and the show spent 3 seasons quietly proving that the most positive man on television is also its most psychologically wounded. The reveal comes almost casually, in a dark scene that fans now consider one of the most devastating moments in the entire series. Ted's father died by suicide when Ted was a teenager. The show doesn't dwell on it. Ted himself barely dwells on it. He delivers the information the way he delivers everything, wrapped in deflection, softened with a joke, moved past quickly before anyone can sit in the weight of it too long. But that single revelation reframes every folksy aphorism, every relentlessly sunny one-liner, every refusal to acknowledge his own pain throughout the entire show. A child who loses a parent to suicide often grows up believing, on some unconscious level, that if he had just been happier, more present, more able to fix the unfixable sadness in the room, the outcome might have been different. Ted's compulsive positivity isn't generosity, it's penance. He became the most relentlessly cheerful person any room has ever contained, because somewhere inside him is a boy who believes that if his father's house had been filled with enough warmth and enough belief, his father might still be alive. The panic attacks that eventually surface, the breakdown he experiences mid-season, aren't betrayals of his character. They're the dam finally cracking, under decades of pressure, that should never have been carried by a teenager in the first place. Rebecca never wanted to win. Rebecca Welton inherits AFC Richmond from her ex-husband Rupert as part of their divorce settlement, and the show's opening premise is that she has hired Ted specifically because she believes an incompetent American coach will destroy the team Rupert loves and give her the revenge she needs. The theory that sits underneath this stated premise says Rebecca's sabotage plan was never really about winning or losing football matches. It was about whether she was capable of wanting anything at all for herself after a marriage that spent years systematically dismantling her sense of what she deserved. Rupert didn't just cheat on Rebecca, he diminished her. He reduced her ambitions, her judgment, and her self-concept to the point where the only goal available to her at the start of the show was a negative one, destroying something he loved, because she had lost the ability to identify anything she loved enough to build toward. The theory says Ted's actual function at AFC Richmond, the one the show never states explicitly, but builds every season around, was not to win matches. It was to give Rebecca a reason to want to win something again. Every moment, Ted models unconditional belief in people who haven't earned it yet. Every moment he refuses to let cynicism become the final word. He is demonstrating directly to the person who hired him to fail that wanting good things for yourself is not naive. It is the only real act of resistance available to someone who was told for years that their wants didn't matter. Nate's villain arc was built by his father. Nate Shelley's descent into cruelty in Season 2 is one of the most discussed character transformations in recent television. The show presents it as a betrayal of Ted's trust and the 911 of a man given opportunity he wasn't equipped to handle. The theory says neither of those framings reaches the actual root. Nate's father is the answer. Revealed across the series in fragments that the show never assembles into a formal origin story, Mr. Shelley is a man who has spent Nate's entire life finding new ways to withhold the specific approval Nate has spent his entire life trying to earn. Not through cruelty, exactly. Through a quieter, more sustained form of disappointment. The kind that never quite names what the person being disappointed did wrong, which means the person being disappointed can never correct it. That kind of conditional, ever-receding love teaches a very specific lesson. It teaches you that approval is never stable, that any kindness shown to you could be revoked at any moment, and that the only protection available is to seize control of the dynamic before someone else seizes it from you. When Ted, the first person who ever gave Nate unconditional belief, distributes that same warmth to other people, Nate doesn't experience it as a healthy, abundant thing. He experiences it as the floor disappearing again, exactly the way it always has with his father. His cruelty toward Will, his betrayal of Ted, his alliance with Rupert, all of it is a man recreating the only emotional pattern he has ever known how to survive inside. The show redeems Nate, not through punishment, but through one honest conversation with his father, because that was always where the damage began. AFC Richmond is a grief therapy group. AFC Richmond is not really a football club in the eyes of the show's writers. It is a controlled environment, deliberately structured to give a specific collection of broken men a place to process trauma they would never otherwise be forced to confront. Look at the men this team actually assembles beyond the coaching staff. Roy Kent, a man who has spent his entire career building emotional walls so total that hugging another person becomes, by the show's own admission, one of the largest single acts of growth he is capable of. Jamie Tart, raised by a father whose cruelty is so consuming that an entire late-season episode is built around a single visit to his childhood home. Watching Jamie absorb decades of conditioning in real time without the language to name what it cost him. Sam Obisanya, navigating identity and belonging across continents, finding that the club represents something his home country doesn't currently offer him. Isaac, whose explosive anger gets addressed directly as something requiring real intervention rather than dismissed as intensity or passion. The theory says the show structured this roster deliberately, assembling a collection of men who each carry a different variation of the same core wound, fathers who failed them, systems that demanded performance over honesty, masculinity models that taught silence as strength. And then it placed Ted, a man working through his own father wound in real time, at the center of all of them. Not coincidentally, specifically, because healing modeled by someone who is also actively struggling reaches people in a way that healing modeled by someone who has already arrived never can. Roy's breakup was the most loving thing he ever did. Roy and Keely's off-screen breakup at the start of Season 3 frustrated audiences more than almost any other decision the show made across its entire run. It happened between episodes, robbing viewers of the process and delivering only the aftermath. And the explanation Roy eventually offers is one the show buries inside a letter he reads aloud in a moment of raw, unguarded honesty. He tells her she never did anything wrong. He tells her it was entirely him. He admits he pulled away because he felt stuck in his own unresolved emotional work and didn't want that stagnation to continue costing her something she deserved to keep. The theory says this is the show's most mature relationship statement, delivered inside its most controversial plot decision. Sometimes, the person who is genuinely right for you arrives in your life before you have finished healing enough to actually receive them. Roy needed individual therapy, individual reckoning with his own emotional avoidance, individual practice at vulnerability with people who weren't Keely, before he could be a partner who added to her life rather than quietly drawing from it. The show's co-creator drew an explicit parallel between Roy's arc and Nate's, both men who had something real and lost it specifically because they hadn't done the internal work required to keep it without damaging it. The breakup wasn't a failure of the relationship. It was Roy choosing not to let an unfinished version of himself permanently define what he and Keely could eventually become. Jamie's kindness toward children is survival memory. Jamie Tart is established early in the series as the show's most straightforward villain candidate, an arrogant, selfish footballer whose talent excuses behavior that no institution around him has ever seriously challenged. The show then spends 3 seasons carefully dismantling that reading by revealing the architecture underneath it. Jamie's father is a man whose cruelty is so specific and so sustained that an entire episode is required to convey its full dimensions. And even then, the episode can only show you a fraction of what Jamie grew up inside. The theory begins with an observation fans made across multiple episodes before the full picture of Jamie's father emerged. Every time Jamie interacts with a child, something changes in him. The performance stops. The armor drops. He becomes patient, careful, and specifically attentive in a way he isn't in any other context with any adult in his life. He is kind to Phoebe, Roy's niece, with a gentleness that the show never explains and Roy notices without fully understanding. The theory says Jamie knows exactly what it costs a child to be treated carelessly by someone with power over them, because he was that child, and the knowledge is stored not in his conscious memory, but in his body. He cannot pass a child without the memory activating. He cannot be cruel in that direction, because being cruel in that direction requires forgetting something he is not capable of forgetting. The show eventually confirms the damage. The theory says the kindness was the confirmation long before the episode did. Keely built her confidence from nothing. Keely Jones is introduced as a model and influencer whose primary function in the show's early episodes is visual. A beautiful woman attached to an arrogant footballer, present in the story but not yet central to it. The show then builds her across 3 seasons into one of its most fully realized characters, a woman who launches her own PR firm, fights for her professional autonomy, and ultimately chooses her own trajectory over the comfort of any relationship available to her. The theory tracks where Keely's confidence actually came from, because the show implies an earlier version of herself that the current Keely has constructed over, not inherited. Her relationship history before Roy is sketched in enough detail to suggest a pattern of attaching herself to men whose reflected status provided a temporary substitute for self-worth she hadn't yet developed independently. Jamie, whatever else he was, gave her visibility. Visibility gave her the platform gave her the audience. And the audience gave her the feedback loop she needed to start believing her own instincts had value beyond how she looked standing next to someone famous. The theory says Keely's arc in Ted Lasso is the show's quietest and most complete story of self-construction. She didn't arrive knowing who she was. She built that person in public, using the tools available to her at each stage, and the show had the discipline to let her finish the build before giving her a relationship that matched it. Beard is the show's true mystery. Coach Beard is the most deliberately opaque character in Ted Lasso, a man defined almost entirely by what the show refuses to tell you about him. He appears in virtually every scene Ted appears in. He agrees with Ted in contexts where agreeing requires ignoring his own evident intelligence. He disagrees with Ted in contexts where the disagreement is so well argued, it changes the direction of the entire conversation. He has an entire episode, Beard After Hours, that is essentially a surrealist portrait of a man the show has spent 2 seasons treating as supporting architecture, suddenly revealed to contain more interior life than anyone around him suspected. The theory says Beard is not Ted's assistant, he is Ted's anchor. The entire reason Ted Lasso functions at all in England, in a sport he doesn't fully understand, in a culture that should reject him completely, is because Beard arrived first, established the translation layer between Ted's instincts and the actual professional environment, and continues operating that layer so quietly and so completely that Ted himself may not fully understand how dependent he is on it. Every room Ted enters successfully, Beard has already calculated. Every relationship Ted builds naturally, Beard has already assessed for structural risk. The show presents Ted as the genius. The theory says Beard is what the genius runs on. And whatever Beard was before he became Ted's coach, whatever the show gestures at in fragments across 3 seasons without ever assembling into a complete picture, is the one story Ted Lasso deliberately chose not to tell. The finale's happy endings might be Leslie's vision. The Ted Lasso finale delivers a sequence of resolutions so clean and so complete that fans immediately split into 2 camps, those who received it as earned and those who found it too convenient to fully trust. Roy, back at Richmond. Nate redeemed and reinstated. Keely thriving independently. Ted, leaving on his own terms rather than being pushed. Every character landing in their best possible version of the future, arranged with the precision of someone who cared deeply about each outcome. The theory, built around the finale's specific structural choices, points to a detail the show embeds and never directly addresses. The montage of happy resolutions occurs across a sequence the show cuts between, in a way that doesn't fully track as linear time. It feels like memory or projection, rather than documented event. Ted's departure is confirmed and real, but the subsequent fates of everyone he leaves behind arrive in a format that the show frames as slightly removed from the straightforward documentary realism it otherwise maintains. The theory says some portion of the finale's happy endings exist inside Ted's own projection of what he is choosing to believe for the people he loves, because leaving them requires believing they will be okay without him. Whether that belief is confirmed or aspirational, the show leaves genuinely open. Ted walked away believing in people. The theory says the finale is what that belief looks like from the inside, not a guarantee, a choice to trust the work he did and let the rest go. Rupert was always the real antagonist. Rupert Mannion is the show's most underexamined character because the show never gives him the interiority it gives everyone else. He exists in Ted Lasso purely as function, the person whose actions produced Rebecca's wound, whose continued presence in her life keeps that wound from fully closing, and whose acquisition of West Ham provides the competitive structure for Season 3. He has no episode of his own. He has no backstory the show treats as worth exploring. He is cruelty without origin, which is the theory's actual point. The show built Rupert as a deliberate contrast to Ted's style of masculinity, Not because Rupert is a cartoon villain, but because Rupert represents a specific, recognizable, and entirely real type of person. The man who uses wealth and charm and institutional access as substitutes for genuine human connection, who cannot tolerate being outperformed and cannot admit being wrong, and who treats every person in his life as a resource to be managed rather than a human being to be known. The theory says Rupert's function in the show is diagnostic. Every character's growth is measured against what they are refusing to become. Rebecca refusing to become someone who weaponizes others. Nate refusing to become someone who mistakes control for respect. Roy refusing to become someone who expresses love only through dominance. Ted refusing to become someone who processes pain by inflicting it. Rupert is what all of them are actively choosing not to be, which is why the show never needs to explain him. He's not the story. He's the thing the story is running away from. Sharon was always Ted's real therapist. Dr. Sharon Fieldstone arrives at AFC Richmond in Season 2 as the club's new sports psychologist hired specifically to work with the players. Ted, who performs relentless cheerfulness as his primary professional identity, treats her arrival as a mild inconvenience, the way any person treats a resource whose existence implies they might need it. The theory tracks the actual therapeutic relationship that develops across Season 2, not the one the show labels as therapy, but the one happening in every other interaction between Ted and Sharon across the entire season. Ted spends the season resisting formal sessions while simultaneously, and without apparent awareness, processing his most significant unresolved material in conversations with Sharon that he refuses to classify as therapy. He talks to her about his father. He talks to her about his marriage. He talks to her about the panic attacks he has been hiding from everyone around him for years. He does all of this in hallways and sidelines and brief exchanges that he can classify as casual rather than clinical, because casual doesn't require him to acknowledge he needs it. The theory says Sharon understood this from the first episode of her tenure at Richmond. She did not push for formal sessions because formal sessions would have triggered Ted's defenses. She created the conditions under which Ted could approach the material on his own terms, at his own pace, through the side door his avoidance left open. The most effective therapy Ted Lasso ever received happened in conversations he spent the entire time insisting weren't therapy. The Amsterdam scene changed everything. In Season 3, Rebecca travels to Amsterdam and has a spontaneous, joyful romantic encounter with a stranger, a pilot, a man who knows nothing about Rupert or Richmond or any of the architecture of damage she has been living inside for years. The show presents this as a romantic interlude that may or may not have further significance, a moment of lightness in a season structured around heaviness. The theory says the Amsterdam scene is the most structurally important moment in Rebecca's entire arc, not because of what it leads to romantically, but because of what it proves to Rebecca about herself. She can want something purely. She can pursue it without calculating its strategic value. She can accept something good without immediately assessing whether she deserves it, or whether it will be taken from her, or whether it is actually a version of the trap she escaped when she left Rupert. The stranger in Amsterdam doesn't know who Rebecca Welton was when she was diminished. He meets the version of her that exists after 3 seasons of slowly, painfully reconstructing a self that Rupert spent years reducing, and she lets herself be met. The theory says that moment, that specific willingness, is the real finale of Rebecca's arc. Everything that follows, including who she ends up with and what she builds with Richmond, is built on the foundation of a woman who proved to herself in Amsterdam that she was capable of accepting something good without immediately finding a reason to give it back. Ted's departure was planned from the start. Ted Lasso ends with Ted returning to Kansas to be present in his son Henry's life, a decision the show presents as emerging from the season's events, but that the theory argues was Ted's plan from the moment he accepted Rebecca's job offer. The evidence is embedded in how Ted has always talked about Henry. Every conversation about his son carries a specific kind of weight that his conversations about AFC Richmond don't match. He enjoys Richmond. He loves the team. He genuinely invests in every person around him with real, consistent care. But Henry is the thing Ted is always partially elsewhere for. The phone calls, the visits structured around school calendars, the quiet sadness underneath every conversation about the distance between Kansas and London. The theory says Ted took the job at AFC Richmond specifically because it gave him something no American football coaching job could have provided: A task large enough, surrounded by people needy enough and rewarding enough to justify the distance from his son for a defined period while he completed the internal work that the divorce had made necessary. He needed to grieve his marriage somewhere that wasn't Kansas. He needed to rebuild his professional identity somewhere that wasn't contaminated by the context in which it had previously existed. Richmond gave him the container. Henry gave him the deadline. And the moment the work was done, the moment the people he came to help had enough to carry it forward without him, Ted left. Not because Richmond failed him, because he had always known when he was supposed to go home.